I'm your host, Colin Mustful. I'm so glad all of you could be with us. I'm really excited about this great panel. So just a few things before I bring our panelists on stage. I'll go over some of the features here of Crowdcast. So as you probably already saw, there is a chat feature on the right side of the screen. Please say hello, let us know where you're joining us from, and we're just glad you could be here. There's an Ask a Question feature right below the chat feature. So that's a little icon with it's a chat box with a question mark in it. Please use that to ask any questions for our panelists. If you have any questions at all for the panelists, click on that instead of putting it in the chat. And then even if you don't have a question, you can open up that Ask a Question feature and vote for the ones that you like. And so whichever ones get the most votes, they'll rise to the top, and I'll be more likely to ask those questions once we get to the Q&A part of the panel. There's also a polls button, an icon of a bar graph there. I put in a couple of fun polls, so feel free to answer those questions. I can already see that someone answered the poll about how many books they've read. Someone has already read more than 15 books this year, so I'd like to know what their secret is. And then finally, on the bottom right below me, there's a button, a green button that says Get Your Book. So I created a landing page with the books for all these authors, and so you can go there. It'll send you to historythroughfiction.com, and it'll show you all of their books. You can read the synopsis for the books, and then if you would like to purchase one, there's a purchase link, and that will actually send you to bookshop.org. And we support book sales through bookshop.org because those sales go to benefit independent bookstores. They give a percentage of the sales to indie bookstores, and we want to support those indie booksellers that do such a great job in everyone's community. Okay, without further ado, I'm going to bring our panelists on stage. All right, welcome everyone. So glad you could be here for this great panel. We have Dora Levy Mossanen, author of Love and War in the Jewish Quarter. We have Ciera Horton McElroy, author of Atomic Family. We have Janie Chang, author of The Porcelain Moon. And we have Heinz Insu Fenkl, author of Skullwater. So let's start with you, Janie, if you could introduce yourself and tell us about your book.
Hello from Vancouver, Canada, or actually a little town just north of Vancouver, Canada. The Porcelain Moon is my fourth work of historical fiction. And usually my books are set in China, and this one is set in World War I France, in the days before the armistice. I'm just such a history nerd, and I always find that doing the research is so much fun that you really have to pull yourself out and remind yourself that you need to actually start writing a book pretty soon. But got through this, and the book was officially published last week on the 21st of February, and I'm so happy to be here to talk about it.
Thanks, Janie. We're glad you could be here to talk about it. Next, let's go to Ciera. Ciera, if you could introduce yourself and tell us about your book.
Of course. I'm Ciera, and Atomic Family is my debut novel. It actually comes out tomorrow. So this is my first event for Publication Week, and I'm just thrilled to be here with you all. My joke is that this year I am having a book baby and a baby because I am 6 months pregnant. So thank you to virtual events for hiding that, but it's also kind of fun. Atomic Family is a novel set in one day. So it's what we call a circadian novel. And it's about the Porter family in 1961 in small town South Carolina, where there is a hydrogen bomb plant. And the father in the story works at this plant and has uncovered some really damning information that he has to decide, am I going to basically be a whistleblower about this? So the book is full of moral conflict and intrigue around the Cold War and the nuclear arms race. So it's historical fiction, but to me feels incredibly timely as these conversations have come back into the public consciousness. So I really love getting to talk about this book and some of the environmental themes in it. And I'm thrilled to be here with you all tonight.
Thanks, Ciera. Yeah, I have a confession. Ciera submitted her manuscript to History Through Fiction, and I got a chance to read it when it was still unpublished, and I really loved it. But I dragged my feet too long, and it got picked up by another publisher. So, but I'm glad to see that it's out, and it's coming out tomorrow, and it's a wonderful read. Let's go to Dora next. Now, Dora was supposed to be with us in November, but we had some technical difficulties, so we invited her back, and everything's going well so far. So, hi, Dora.
Hi, Colin. Thank you so much for having me and trying again because the last time was. But anyways, I'm Dora Levy Mossanen, and this is my 5th historical novel. Came out in November 8th, and it's wonderful that it has been so well received. I'm still on tour and nearly have speaking somewhere, and the book is actually about it's a love story that takes place in the Jewish quarter in Iran, and during World War II, a time when Iran was instrumental in the fight against Hitler, but very little in the West, very few in the Western world know about it. So I would love then later on maybe to discuss the inspiration for this book, because that is an interesting story in itself. And here I am, happy to be with all of you.
Wonderful. Thanks, Dora. And finally, let's go to Insu. If you could introduce yourself and tell us about your book.
I'm Heinz Fenkl. I'm a professor at the State University of New York in New Paltz. We're actually waiting for the blizzard to arrive right now. And I teach in the brand new creative writing track in the graduate program. And I also teach in Asian studies. And of course, I'm also a writer. I also translate. I'm a folklorist too, and a semiotician theoretically. And my novel, Skullwater, which just came out February 7th, it's an autobiographical story set in 2 timelines. It's primarily about a group of mixed race children of military American fathers and Korean mothers who are living in a camp town. And the character based on myself, Insu, is very close to his mother's eldest brother, whom he calls Big Uncle. And Big Uncle has a mysterious foot infection that has caused him to be exiled across the river from the village. And when Insu hears that there's a folk remedy, the skull water that accumulates in a human skull after death that can cure anything, he and his friends set out on this quest to get it for Big Uncle. And of course, all sorts of misadventures and tragedies ensue. So that's the basic outline of my book. But one of the interesting things about it from a historical perspective is the parallel timelines. One is the Korean War, and the other is the 70s, right as the Vietnam War is ending. And the culture, of course, is the military culture in South Korea. So thank you all for coming.
Thanks, Insu. Yeah, it sounds fascinating, and I really love your cover, so I might have to ask you about your cover a little bit later. Well, let's go back to Janie. Janie, I want to know more about the history included in your novel. So it's about a little-known history of 140,000 Chinese workers brought to Europe as non-combatant labor during World War I. How did you learn about this history, and can you tell us more about what it was?
Yes. Well, being a history nerd, I figured I knew the broad strokes of World War I. And then I came across an article about how the city of Liverpool was going to put up a monument to recognize the contribution of the Chinese Labor Corps, men who had been sent from China to France and England during the First World War to serve as civilian labor. And right now, I'm sure you are also saying what Chinese that got sent to Europe during the First World War, because not a clue, right? So you go down the rabbit hole of research, and it turns out that what happened was, after the horrific battles of the Somme and Verdun, Europe basically had run out of men, able-bodied men. And it's not just for fighting that they need men and soldiers. They also needed laborers to keep the machinery of war going, the logistics and the supply lines. You know, they needed people to repair the roads and the railways after they've been bombed. They needed people to unload and load ammunition and supplies and food and medicines and, you know, fuel to get to transport all of this stuff to the front lines, and, you know, to dig the trenches and cut the lumber to get the lumber to shore up the trenches. And so this is, you know, the infrastructure of war. And Hollywood would try to have us believe that all the good stories are out in the front lines with the glories of battle. But actually, there was a lot going on behind the scenes to allow the glories of battle at the front lines to happen. So when I read about this, I just thought, you know, I want to write a book of fiction which will acknowledge the sacrifice of these men, because some of them did die. They were supposed to be away from the front lines because they were civilian labor, but, you know, planes fly across the front lines. There are always accidents. There was disease, the Spanish flu. So a lot of them lost their lives. And I wanted to acknowledge that sacrifice. And also, I think that for those of us who love history, it's important to us to understand to have a more complete picture, and not the picture that Hollywood brings to us. I mean, it wasn't just Chinese laborers, although they were certainly the largest and longest serving contingent of civilian labor, 140,000 of them who stayed for 3 to 5 years. The French brought in soldiers from Vietnam, from Indochina, one of their colonies. They brought in workers and soldiers from Algeria. The British brought in Sikhs from India, from South Africa. And yet those stories just do not get the same kind of airplay and visibility as white European history. So that was, you come across a little tidbit like that and you dive down the rabbit hole.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought it forward in your novel. I teach social studies at a high school, and in fact, just today I was working on an essay with a student about the effects of World War I across the world, and you know, a subject like this never comes up in the curriculum. I didn't know about it, so just so glad that for authors like you that can bring that forward and make it compelling for readers. Ciera, let's go to you. First of all, I have to admit, I didn't know the term circadian novel. So maybe you can talk a little bit about why you chose that format. I also want to know more about this family, the Porter family. Who are they and what are they going through?
Of course. Well, the circadian novel became popular with books like Mrs. Dalloway. And so it's a really compressed timeline that allows you to explore ordinary life and the effects of, in most cases of these books, modernization on the individual. And I always just loved the format. I fell in love with it. I loved the hours. There's several great books. Saturday by Ian McEwan is also circadian. And I love that it forces us to pay attention to the small details of someone's life that can have really significant impact and weight. And it just spoke to the kind of story that I wanted to tell, which, just to echo off what Janie was saying, my book is about the Cold War, but when we think about the Cold War, we probably think of what Hollywood tells us, like spies and the space race, all these big flashy stories. And this is very different. This is a pretty ordinary American family, small town life. And I wanted to capture what it may have been like for an average person growing up in the Cold War. So the Porter family, we have the father who works at the hydrogen plant. He doesn't think of himself as anyone flashy or special. He's a soil scientist. And so his work kind of goes under the radar. But what he does at the plant is he oversees the disposal of nuclear waste. And what that meant at the time was just burying it and saying, we'll deal with this later. This, by the way, really happened. We also just put it in the ocean, and there's huge environmental disasters that we're still dealing with from these decisions. And so he has his conflict in the book about, what do I do with the fact that I have been complicit in this? And that now I realize it has been dangerous to the entire community, but I can't talk about it. And his wife, Nellie, is a disgruntled housewife who feels so small in the shadow of her husband's work. She feels like no matter what she does, it won't be remembered by history. It won't be considered important. And what she also hates is that she is forever outside his world looking in. And she compares herself to the Audrey Hepburn character, Holly Golightly, in Breakfast at Tiffany's. She's just a window watcher on his world. And so they have some deep marital conflict. And then we have the little boy, who's my favorite character. His name is Wilson, and he is an example to me of the American child in the Cold War who was absorbing all of the propaganda given to children, the duck and cover drills, the warnings, the games and television and comic books about war is coming, atomic war is coming, and he believes it. He takes it at face value, the way children do. They absorb the concerns of the adult world and take it as literal fact. And so he has turned their fallout shelter into a clubhouse. He has started preparing to hunt communists in their town. And the book explores the impact of that kind of anxiety of always thinking disaster is about to happen at any moment. So it explores that from the three perspectives in the course of 24 hours.
Thanks, Ciera. I had Ciera on our podcast, and we kind of talked about some of the craziness that has gone on, in the last few years. And we just internalize that and think it's just happening to us. But what your book does so nicely is it sets us in that time and place and kind of reminds us that what we're going through isn't unique. It's just a part of the continuous cycle of history, I think. Dora, let's go to you. Your main character is a dentist, which I think is pretty rare. Why don't you tell us about Dr. Solomon Yaron and what his challenges are in your novel?
Yes, I'd love to do that. Actually, the inspiration for my novel, Love and War in the Jewish Quarter, was my grandfather, Dr. Habib Levy, who was a historian who wrote the comprehensive history of Iranian Jews. And I remember having heard from him in person about an event that took place when he also became Reza Shah, the last kings, Mohammad Reza Shah's, the last king who was ousted by the Islamic Revolution in Iran. His father, Reza Shah, my grandfather was his dentist. So my grandfather, when I was quite young, maybe 10 years old, I heard it from him in person. I still didn't speak Farsi very well because I am born in Israel. I only spoke Hebrew, and I came to Iran. But I really needed to hear what my grandfather had to say, knowing that he was a historian. I always saw him writing. So he told me about this event, which I actually then again read in his memoirs. And I thought, oh my God, I have to write about this. And this was the event. The king, Reza Shah, who was actually a very formidable, scary person, summoned my grandfather to the royal court. And he said, Levy, I like you, but we have a big problem here. And my grandfather is, yes, Your Majesty, but what problem? He said, you're Jewish. And at the time, and long before then, Jews were believed to be impure, najis or impure, meaning, and now here the king didn't want the hand of a Jew in his mouth. And so he said, I know how to solve the problem. You just say the oath of Shahada and convert to Islam. So my grandfather, knowing that it might be his last words, turned around and told him, Your Majesty, a man who turns his back to his faith is a traitor, and Your Majesty will not want a traitor for a dentist. Now, that was the first spark, which I thought, and then, of course, there's more explanation what had happened to my grandfather, who was well liked by the king because he was Parisian educated, because he was also the first Jewish soldier in the army. So I thought this is a time when it's not well known, or perhaps even not known at all to the Western world. And I love research. I too, like my grandfather, I'm constantly researching history. And so I thought, okay, I can set this. The backdrop can be World War II in Iran, in the Jewish quarter, where I have my own dentist, Dr. Soleiman Yaran. And what happens if at a time like this, where Jews were basically segregated in ghettos because they were believed to be so impure that they could sully anything they got in touch with. What happens if this Jewish dentist falls in love with the Muslim wife of the most or second most influential, powerful man in Iran, which is what happens in the story and the consequences of that. But I have to bring something else to your attention, which took me by complete surprise, which was that I had started this book more than 6 years ago. Little did I know then how timely this book will be, in that, as you all know, there is a revolution now for the last nearly 3 or 4 months happening in Iran that was instigated by the women of Iran. This is the first in history, and has raised the rallying cry of woman, woman, life, freedom. I say it in Farsi. Zan Zendegi also. So I have to translate it. And it's still going on. And throughout my novel, there is that string of, how women, and this happens like more than 80 years ago, how they were treated as a property at the time, and how now, after having gone through the Pahlavis dynasty rule for the last 44 years, the Islamic Revolution has tossed them back into the Middle Ages, where they have to cover their hair, where Mahsa Amini will be murdered by the morality police because her hair was not properly covered. And here I am sitting here with my hair blue, and tomorrow it might be purple. I mean, it makes me want to cry. So I'll stop here.
Thank you, Dora. Just another great example of how important it is to share history. I mean, it's very startling to hear that story about your family and of course, relating it to today. And it's just extremely unfortunate that these things continue, but that's why we need to tell our stories, just like you have. Well, let's go next to Insu. Yours is a personal connection, so I want to hear about what it's like to write autobiographical fiction, why you decided to do that. But I want to know more about this relationship between the main character Insu and his big uncle.
Yes. Well, first, I'd like to say I have a lot of reading to do now. But those books sound wonderful. And it always strikes me the parallelisms that appear. Because as in Jamie's novel, one of the things I'm doing is I'm sort of documenting a lost history the Korean War, for example, was known as the Forgotten War. And also I'm depicting things that if Hollywood were to be the repository of representations of Korea and the Korean War, we'd be left with movies and TV shows like MASH. And one of the things I'm doing is showing the real underbelly of the condition of mixed race children, right, who lived in the camp towns. And then one of the parallelisms with Ciera's books that struck me as really coincidental is in my novel, there's a character, Patsy, who actually dresses up like Holly Golightly and goes through downtown Seoul in the mid-70s because that's her big dream. Breakfast at Tiffany's was one of the most popular romantic films in South Korea, and women were obsessed with not just with Audrey Hepburn and her wonderful mod look, but also there were men who wanted to look like George Peppard. But one of the settings of my novel, one of the primary settings is ASCOM, which when it was turned, it's the largest military installation in Korea in the past that was inherited from the Japanese. And when it was turned over to Korea, it was an ecological disaster in terms of cleanup because it had been one of the repositories of dioxin. And I think there were a couple of lawsuits brought by veterans who had served there. So, and then like Dora's novel, there's the issue of purity. Big Uncle is exiled across the river because he has this mysterious foot infection that will not go away. And he has refused to get his foot amputated, according to lots of doctors' recommendations. And the source of that infection is actually like a ghost story. It was from a supernatural woman. And one of the things that I do in the depiction of his time during the opening days of the Korean War, when he's trying to escape and make his way to Busan, is he runs across a young woman who's on the same trip, and they actually become companions. And later in the novel, there's a surprising revelation that she has become one of the most powerful women in the black marketing community in South Korea. So all these interesting karmic connections. But a lot of my book is autobiographical. So I did do a significant amount of research, especially for the Korean War era. But most of the research I did was confirming things that I remembered. And I was continuously shocked by how accurate memory can be, but also how little things kind of erode, right? Like the place names and especially things like chronology, and one's mental map is always strangely distorted. But one of the things I tried to do was to show the unexpected parallelisms of what was going on in the Korean War era for my big uncle, who grew up during the Japanese colonial era and then survived the transition from the end of World War II. After Japan's surrender, there was only a 5-year period before the outbreak of the Korean War. And then the whole country was devastated. 10 million families were separated. The entire peninsula was basically so badly bombed that I still remember from my childhood, there was hardly a tree that was over 10 feet tall. There was only one area in South Korea that still had old growth forests after that. Because during the colonial era, Japan had logged Korea. And then during the war, the amount of bombing was just incredible. And then in the 70s story with the character Insu and his friends, who are also of mixed race, they're living in a condition in which the country is run by a military dictator who's pretending it's a democracy. This is the Park Chung-hee era. And there's a large-scale United States military presence. There's a continuous threat of invasion from North Korea. And this is also the time when the Vietnam War was ending, and Korea had been they had been assisting the United States, project in Vietnam for over a decade at the time. So the legacy of the Vietnam War, the Korean War, Japanese colonial era, and then the threat from the North are all things that are sort of imbued in the atmosphere of the novel. And in the thing that joins Big Uncle's story with Insu's, ironically, is it sort of begins with storytelling. So the narrative is also woven together by Korean traditions like folklore and the three primary religious traditions that weave through the country's culture.
I think that's what I really love about your story is you bring those personal elements, those personal observations to this history. You bring in some of the culture and folklore. Again, it's things that, from my narrow perspective as an American growing up in the 1990s, I don't see those things, learn those things. I can't understand those things until someone like you comes along and gives us some context and perspective. So I think that's really wonderful. Well, things are moving right along here. As you have heard, these are all really fascinating books, really fascinating histories. We won't have time to go too deep into them, so you'll have to get those books. And so remember, you can, if you click on that Get Your Book button. I also want to remind people that there is a Q&A. I see we do have one question in there. So if you do have a question for one of our panelists, just click on that Q&A on the right side. And I'm going to get to that with about 15 minutes left in the event. I'll ask those questions from the audience. But moving on, let's go back to Janie. Janie, I was blown away to learn that your family history includes 36 generations of recorded genealogy. Can you tell us how that's possible and maybe what you've learned from it?
So, I know that it sounds really impossible, but you'll have to remember that China was a Confucian society. So honoring your elders was very important, honoring your ancestors. And my family, or my dad's family, had a scholarly tradition. Therefore, they just kept the genealogy for that many generations. My great-grandfather was the last person of his to print a new genealogy. And what they did was every couple of generations, they would hire calligraphers and artisans who would carve the wood blocks, and they would set up the printing press, and a new edition of the family genealogy would be printed and distributed to all the branches of the family. And when the communists took over China, this sort of thing was extremely bourgeois and very dangerous to own. And yet my uncle, my dad's youngest brother, did manage to hide a copy of our family genealogy. And he hid this for 40 years until China opened up, and he was able to come to Canada and see my dad, and the two brothers got together for the first time in 40 odd years. And he brought with him, the 5 volumes of genealogy, which I have now, but I can't hold it up to show it to you because, as you can see, I've got packing boxes behind me. We only just moved a few months ago and the house is still a mess, and this is my temporary office. But I also want you to know that our family was not unusual. I won't say that it was common, but it was not unusual for families to keep this type of genealogy. It's just that so many of these were lost during the Cultural Revolution in China, when this was seen as very vain, very bourgeois, yearning for the old imperial system. And now apparently the Museum and Library of Shanghai is asking the Chinese diaspora, anybody who's living outside of China, who still has these genealogies, to bring them back so that they can trace the movements and history of the population that way.
Well, how wonderful that your family was able to save them and that you still have them. That's just incredible.
Yeah. Oh, I should just say that I do include a lot of family stories in my novels, but they didn't come out of the genealogy. I was kind of disappointed when the genealogy arrived, because I thought they would be filled with stories about my ancestors, and my dad's going, "Nah, it's basically a list of names, and who was whose son. There's only men. There's no women listed."
That's too bad.
Yeah.
But so then you have some oral history then that you're able to share?
Yeah. At one point, I asked my father if he would just talk into a tape recorder and tell me everything that he remembered about all the stories that his father and grandfather and told him about our family ancestors. So I have my 7 times great grandfather actually walked through a portal into the land of immortals, and he became an immortal. And this is the same 7 times great grandfather who saw a dragon and who saw 2 immortals playing chess. And that's when he knew that at one point in his life, he would have the chance to join them.
Very cool. Well, it sounds like you have a lot more stories if you ever want to write them.
They're done. Yeah.
Well, let's go to Ciera. Ciera, we've talked a lot about history and writing already. Can you tell us about your experience publishing a novel? Because you're a debut novelist. Your book comes out tomorrow. What's it all been like for you?
Happy to chat about publishing. Yes, this is my debut, and I am on the young side. I'm 27. I began my book in college. I feel like that's maybe unusual for a debut. I was an undergrad. I was 19, and I had just read some beautiful connected short story collections like Olive Kitteridge, and wanted to try doing a linked story cycle. And I decided to write about this family, the Porter family, and on theme tonight, that came from family history. And my grandfather was a nuclear scientist, and so it kind of spurred from there. But in short, I realized this was not a short story collection. This was a novel, and I didn't want to do the different timelines and different intersecting stories. And so during my MFA program, my Master's of Fine Arts and Creative Writing, I rewrote it as a novel during a novel workshop. So what that means is I took a summer, I wrote it as a novel. It was read by other writers and completely torn apart because it needed to be completely restructured. So I rewrote the book again from scratch. I didn't even look at my first draft. This is what works for me. I write the draft and then put it away and then write it all completely again. That time I queried. So that's when you reach out to literary agents, and I signed with my agent after finishing my MFA program. And then we were going on submission, and it was March of 2020, which was awesome. So we decided to basically wait until the dust settled, and we went back out on submission about a year after that. So it's a long process to get a book out. I started this when I was 19, and it took a long time. So I'm young, but it still takes years and years and years to get into the publishing world, at least in my experience. But I guess one thing that I have learned is just how many people it takes to champion your work. Everyone says it takes a village, and that is completely true, but I did not know who would be in that village besides an editor, a publisher, right? All the different people, from the cover designer to the publicists to the social media assistants to the booksellers who've championed the book to interviewers to podcasters who really go into making a book launch successful. That has been really eye-opening to me, and my publisher has been a huge champion and has sent me on tour. So it's a big process, but I've learned a lot and I've loved it.
Well, congratulations, Ciera.
Thank you.
I'm glad that I've been able to watch some of it, since we met in March of 2020. And so, yeah, we can kind of see you go through this process.
Well, I appreciate it. Yeah, it's crazy, but it's worth it. This crazy artistic thing we do on our computers, it turns out into a real thing that people get to read. And that's just, it's beautiful. I don't think I'll ever quite get over that.
Well, Dora, let's go back to you. You're, in addition to being a novelist, you're a journalist. Can you talk about how you compartmentalize the different types of writing? Maybe what are the differences and how are they the same? And are there any challenges for you in switching from one form to the other?
There are challenges for sure. I usually, my style is somewhat fantastical, magical realism. The history background is all very deeply researched and true. But then I always like to plant this in my fiction and novel writing. I always like to have the freedom of planting my own fictional characters into the story and see where they take me, basically. That is one part of the writing that I tremendously enjoy, where I am surprised by my own characters every step of the way. When you write a piece that is journalistic or a review, it has to be, you cannot put any of your own fictional thoughts or, there's not that freedom to go on to write. So yes, there is a shift that happens where one side of your brain, you have to shut the door to imagination, let's call it, and do your research, find out all about it, and write down the truth of the situation. I enjoy that as well, but if I were, free on my own, which of course most of the time I am, then I like to go into that world and create, my Dr. Yaran, having become the dentist of Queen Fawzia, who was a true queen, the first wife of Mohammad Reza Shah. But then in the meantime, also research the history of the time and learn a lot about what I didn't know, and then present it to the world. And the reaction that I get is so satisfactory for me from my readers. And things like what happened with this book happens, which it happens to be published November of 2022, when there's this uprising in Iran. And just to say something to you, Ciera, it never becomes easy. Your first book, your second, your third, your fourth, your fifth, it is always difficult to get your books into the right hands, and eventually see it published, which is a wonderful thing, to have your books in covers, hold them, and then be in communication with your readers. Very satisfying.
Thank you, Doris. I'm glad to hear your perspective about those differences. And yeah, it's definitely satisfying to get that reader feedback.
Yeah.
We do have some questions from the audience. Before I get to those, I do want to ask Insu about his work as a translator. If you can tell us about what you do and why you do it, and why that's important.
Well, I sort of became a writer and a translator simultaneously by accident. It was when I was in 7th grade, living in Germany on the U.S. Army base in Baumholder. The 7th grade English teacher required that we write 2 pages a week in our spiral notebooks. And I didn't realize that other kids had the notebooks with the wide rules. I had the college ruled notebook. And I also wrote with a fountain pen, and my writing was minuscule, and I could actually write 2 lines between every one of those blue lines, because in my family, paper was very precious. A scrap of blank paper was a rarity, and it was immensely difficult to fill those 2 pages. And what I came up with was, I sort of miss Korea, and I don't have much to say, but if I write down the stories my uncles told me, I could probably write some stuff. So I inadvertently became a translator and a folklorist and a writer all in one accidental swoop. My teacher initially was shocked by my notebook, I think by the tiny writing that he could barely read. But then when he read it, he was very encouraging. And so between him and my 9th grade English teacher, who then kind of weaned me off of pulp novels and Robert E. Howard and H.P. Lovecraft, and introduced me to writers like Brodigan and Hemingway and Bradbury, that is sort of how I gravitated towards literary writing. And I think that the translation became much more important later when I started doing research of those Korean folktales that I had written as a 7th grader. One of the things I discovered was that the ones that were told to me had all been mangled. Because my uncles were storytellers, they were changing the stories. They were making themselves the main characters or family members. They changed endings. And when I looked at the type index of Korean folklore, which is like an encyclopedia of outlines of stories from various regions, I discovered that out of the more than 1,000 stories in there, I knew almost 80% of them, but in really weird, distorted versions. So I became a more formal studier of folklore. And then I was also exploring my own trajectory as a writer. And to do that, I had to start reading Korean literature. And at that time, translations of Korean literature into English were actually pretty bad. I could, in fact, in the translated type index I read, if I had not known those stories already, I would not have been able to figure out what was going on because the translation was so bad. So then I took it upon myself sort of as a mission to translate things that I thought were important. There are things like government grants, and today Korean fiction has become internationally popular. So there's a commercial interest in it. But prior to that, it was a non-lucrative venture that was like an academic and personal mission for many people. And so I've been very selective about the things I've translated. The hardest ones were Buddhist narratives. I spent 12 years translating The Nine Cloud Dream by Kim Man-jung. It's a 17th century Korean Buddhist novel that's written in Tang Dynasty Chinese. And that actually includes 2 immortals playing chess, because it's an imitation of Tang literature. And in doing that, and also translating Buddhist poetry, I learned quite a lot about both the complexity of language, but also the unreliability of language. And that actually helped me tremendously as a writer of my own work.
That's such a great story, just from beginning to end, hearing you talk about all that. And I really love that, just hearing that something at such an early age made that impact on you, just the difference between wide-ruled and college-ruled notebook. That's so amazing. Well, we do have some questions here from the audience. So I'm going to start here with Leslie's question. She says, to all the authors, what degree did your research and factual discoveries limit, help, or change your story ideas and your characters? Janie, would you like to start us off there?
Absolutely. And that's a great question, because if you're writing serious historical fiction, you want to be as accurate as possible. And yet absolute total accuracy can really constrain the freedom of writing fiction. You should always read the author's notes at the back of a work of historical fiction, because that's where we confess what was real and what we made up. The main rule that I have, and the best way to describe it, I'm going to give credit to my friend Jennifer Robson, is if you're going to fictionalize, is it plausible and is it feasible? So the example that I would give is from her book, where Eleanor Roosevelt travels to World War II London during the Blitz, and brings and meets a young American female reporter. So is it plausible? did Eleanor Roosevelt actually go to London during the Blitz? And so, yes, so it's feasible in terms of timing and what actually happened in the real world. Is it plausible? Is it plausible that she would take the time to get to know a young American journalist? And there again, it is plausible because Eleanor Roosevelt was, believed in helping, believed in women having a bigger share of life and being able to do more. So if she'd run into a young woman of her own nationality, she probably would have struck up the acquaintance. So is it feasible and is it plausible?
Janie, you answered that so well. I feel like maybe you planted that question. Have Leslie?
No, actually, we get asked that a lot.
Ciera, do you have anything to add to that?
I'll just add from my personal experience with the book that what I researched actually changed a lot of the trajectory once I was working on the novel. So there's this event in the book called the Women's Strike for Peace March. It was a huge anti-nuclear protest movement led by women in 1961. And it was the largest gathering of women since the suffrage movement. So it was quite significant historically. This is before second wave feminism. I had never heard of it before. And I'm just researching the lives of, American housewives going into the 60s, figuring out the plot for my character. And I came across this and it changed the entire book. It made so much sense that this character would protest not only nuclear war in theory, but the work that her husband is doing. And it changed the entire scope of the book. And that happens sometimes. And I think letting yourself have the freedom to develop your characters and plot as you discover aspects of the history that are unknown to you is a really freeing and beautiful part of the artistic process. Because there's so much we don't know. Like I felt like I knew a lot about the Cold War and then discovered this whole other chapter that had just been omitted from all of my history and even all of my women's studies in college. So that's just an example from my own work and how it shaped the plot itself.
Yeah, that research really opens things up and helps you to share so much more you weren't expecting. Dora, do you have anything to add to that?
Yes, I would love actually to add to, you're right, Jenny, it's very important that it's plausible, but also in the context of time. I chose that time, 1941 through 1944, not only because World War II takes place during that time, but there were so many events, and the highlight that I can think about now is the meeting of the big three, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin, in Tehran, and the drama that surrounded that. And it was so important for me that I have that in my book. But then I had to change a lot of historical events to fit that time and era and that specific meeting. So it's fun, but it can be restrictive in some ways. So yes.
Thank you, Dora. And you didn't even miss a step there when the earbud fell out. Good job.
No, and I cannot find it. Oh, there it goes. All right, go on. Thanks.
Well, Insu, let's go to you. But I want to ask you, well, first, if you have anything to add to this discussion. And then there is another question here. So maybe if you can add to the research discussion. And then another question from Jenny. She says, dual timelines seem common. Why choose dual timeline for example, Insu's?
Well, first, I'd like to add to the issue of plausible and feasible. And because I was writing an autobiographical novel, one of the things I had to constantly ask myself is representation of reality itself plausible? And one of the ironies is that the things that really happened are often less plausible than fiction. So a lot of things had to be left out. because they're too incredible. They would seem like they were exaggerated. But the other thing I discovered was one of the things I discovered in my research was actually quite surprising, because I was checking to see if my uncle's stories were also plausible, or whether I was getting another, made up war story that he had exaggerated. And when I researched the time and the place of an incident that he had described, I discovered that he had inadvertently been a witness to the mass execution of Korean prisoners during the opening days of the war. It was something that had not come to light until a American-Korean joint investigation in the mid-1980s. So it was an interesting case of historical research actually confirming something which I thought might have been just a tall tale. Now, the question of the dual timeline, for Skullwater, it was very important to show the parallelism between Big Uncle's story and Insu's story, and the only way to do that was to tell Big Uncle's story, but it's written in first person, so that created a weird kind of constraint. And so what I had to do was distinguish the point of view in such a way that it was Insu narrating Big Uncle's experience, but through a very unusual use of third person. So it's a very, if you read the book, you'll see that the third person parts from over Big Uncle's shoulder are told in a kind of different narrative language, which the readers will figure out. But it was a way of showing that this is Big Uncle's story, but it's also filtered through Insu's imagination. And one of the themes that runs through the whole novel is what Big Uncle and the Buddhists are telling Insu, which is that dreams and reality are not distinguishable ultimately. And it was another way of, the parallel storyline was also a way of showing that the past and the present are also often indistinguishable in one's mind. And then thematically, that weaves together with the notion of reality and dream as well, in a novel in which autobiographical narrative and fiction are also interwoven. And that's, I'm not even mentioning the way the I Ching was used to create structure in it. So all of those things were a kind of interwoven necessity in the structure of the book, because it doesn't follow a traditional plot the way you would imagine a typical novel would.
Well, thanks. And so you brought up, the craft of fiction, the artwork of it. And I'm so glad you're able to, there's definitely a lot of moving parts, and it's nice to kind of see behind the scenes of how you're able to do all those things. Well, I want to ask one more question for all of you. We're up against the clock here. I want to thank everyone for their participation. This has been a great panel. It's moved very quickly, but the audience has been really wonderful, posting comments and questions. So I'm sorry we can't get to all those questions. Hopefully, I know there's some discussion about adding to your TBR list. So hopefully all of you got these books on your TBR lists. But before we end, I just want to ask each of you about the value of historical fiction, because that's what this press is about, history through fiction. Why write historical fiction? So Janie, let's start with you.
I think that historical fiction, Insu talked about the parallels between history and our current day life. I think that by reading historical fiction, we understand who we are today. You can write about some injustice that has happened through the lens of the past, and it might be softer and maybe a little less, what's the word for it? A little less triggering, or maybe a little less offensive to some people. And then hopefully enough people will realize, but hey, this is still happening today. For example, women are still being married off by their families against their will. They not enough agency. So and I also think that historical fiction, to me, is it's like the gateway drug to real history. Hopefully, if our books get capture people's imaginations, they will then go to the encyclopedia or go to nonfiction books to find out the truth behind what we wrote up as entertainment.
Yes, thank you, Janie. Very well said. Ciera, what do you think about the value of historical fiction?
Oh, so much. How do I answer in like 30 seconds? I echo everything Janie said, of course, but I feel like historical fiction is an immersive way to learn. It's more engaging than a textbook, right? And I feel like for me personally, I remember the history that I've experienced through the eyes of a character much more than I will remember the history I learned through a lecture or podcast or any other form. And, the books that shaped my childhood were the ones about history and opening my eyes to someone else's experience that I could never live on my own. So I think that in a nutshell is what it is for me, is it's an immersive way to experience the world.
Yeah, it gives us empathy for what others have gone through.
Mm-hmm.
Dora, what do you think? Why is historical fiction so valuable?
It is quite valuable, and I've always known that, not only because it opens worlds to readers who might not know much about those times or worlds, but what I've mostly learned in Love and War in the Jewish Quarter especially was how a book that was started 6-7 years ago would end up engaging readers in order to get involved. Let's say in this case, an example is the plight of Iranian women. Iranian women and men now need the help of the world. And it gives me great pleasure to know that at least my book in some way has brought that to light, engaged them in a way, wanted them to help, raise their voices however they can. And, each one of my books, they happen in different times, and I've had different experiences with them where readers would come and say, we didn't know about that time. We didn't know about this problem. And how can we help? And this to me is really precious.
Yeah, it definitely engages people to action. And what's great is that your
Yes.
book is always going to be there. It's
Yes.
Well, Insu, if you could bring it home for us.
Well, we all know the old adage, right? Those who don't learn the lessons of history are doomed to repeat them. But also, people remember stories and not facts. And I remember very clearly when I was in second, third, and fourth grade, there was a series of books I would get from the library. They all began with "You were there. You were there on the Oregon Trail. You were there at the Battle of the Bulge," and these children's novels all featured a boy and a girl who were stuck in the middle of. And actually, speaking of plausibility, most of the stories were pretty implausible, but they were incredibly engaging. And I remember what they did was they actually got me interested in the history. So after reading "You Were There at the Battle of the Bulge," I would get a historical book on the Battle of the Bulge because there were vivid images I could associate with them. And the facts began to have meaning. And I think for that reason, historical fiction is absolutely important. It's a way of getting people to viscerally experience the lessons of history without having to abstract them from some narrative that's woven together with a bunch of dates and names and facts. So I am a very strong fan and supporter of historical fiction.
Yeah, definitely. I'm so glad to hear you say that. That just to hear how it inspires people. And nowadays, I mean, I don't know about you guys when you read, but I'm on Google every couple pages I have to Google something.
Yeah.
You don't have to nowadays. You don't have to go to the library or go get a book, but it could, definitely leads to more research. Well, thanks again to our fabulous panelists. Thanks to our wonderful audience. This replay will be available at this link on Crowdcast. So the link we're on right now, it will be available on replay immediately after the event ends. And I will also put it on our YouTube channel, History Through Fiction's YouTube channel. So thanks again. Pick up these great books from these wonderful authors, and everyone, please have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody. Thank you.
Good night.
Well, thank everyone for coming.